For heaven's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed. All murdered.
Quoting Shakespeare late into the night, spinning stories, watching stars from the nearby Naval Observatory. These were some of the diversions that took Lincoln's mind off the haunting concern of not yet having found the right general for his armies. Since the very beginning, Lincoln had combed through the roster of military men, searching for the right leader. General Scott, old and sick. General McClellan, uncooperative and slow. General Halleck, timid and testy. Lincoln was astonished at Halleck's breakdown after the Battle of Second Manassas.
Nerve and pluck all gone. A little more sense than a first-rate clerk.
For most of 1862 and 1863, Lincoln himself served as general-in-chief, as one after another his generals failed him. Inept Burnside at Fredericksburg, bragging overconfident Hooker at Chancellorsville, and then nervous old snapping turtle Meade, as Lincoln called him, who had failed to follow up his Gettysburg victory with the death blow to the Confederacy. Where to turn? Finally, from out of the ranks, a new Western star had begun to rise, a taciturn, go-it-his-own-way fighting man named Ulysses S. Grant. He was Lincoln's type of man, log cabin raised, unassuming, careless in dress, unconcerned with protocol. Though merely an average student at West Point, once a leather salesman, a heavy drinker, he had not earned his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, for nothing.
Find me the name of his brand, and I'll send some of it to my other general. I can't spare this man. He fights.
On the day after the Battle of Gettysburg, Grant had won the most important victory of the war in a Mississippi River town called Vicksburg. What followed was a string of Union triumphs in the West at places like Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. The Confederacy, said Lincoln, was now like an animal with a thorn in its vitals.
Lincoln tended to like Western commanders and to admire Western armies more than he did those in the East. This, in part, was because he himself was a frontiersman and understood the Western mentality. Of his generals, Grant best represented that Western approach. He alone of Lincoln's generals never asked for anything, never requested additional supplies. He simply went along, made his plans, acted, and then told the White House about it. Once, for instance, in the campaign against Vicksburg, Grant crossed the river and disappeared into the central part of Mississippi. A worried observer came to the White House and told Lincoln that Grant had gone, that nobody knew where he had disappeared to. And Lincoln said to him, well, Grant reminds me of a fellow I used to see at the county fair. He climbed up a pole and pulled the pole up after him. Grant knew what he was doing, and Lincoln knew what Grant was doing.
Within weeks, Mary Lincoln's much younger half-sister, Emily Todd Helm, arrived in Washington. The war had torn the Todd family of Kentucky apart. In September, Emily's husband, Ben Hardin Helm, a Confederate general, had been killed at Chickamauga.
Mr. Lincoln and my sister met me with the warmest affection. We were all too grief-stricken at first for speech. I have lost my husband. They have lost their fine little son, Willie. And the future, alas, the future seems empty of everything but despair.
You know, little sister, I tried to have Ben come with me. I hope you do not feel I am to blame for all this sorrow.
While my husband loved him and had been deeply grateful to him for his generous offer to make him an officer in the Federal Army, he had to follow his conscience and side with his own people. Mr. Lincoln put his arms around me, and we both wept. After I'd said goodnight and had gone to my room last night, there was a gentle knock at the door, and Sister Mary's voice. "Emily, may I come in?" She was smiling, and her eyes were wide and shining. It's unnatural and abnormal. It frightens me.
It was becoming clear that under the stress of war and personal loss, Mary's mental health was breaking down. She now admitted that she had lately been seeing the ghost of her son, Willie.
I want to tell you, Emily, if Willie did not come to comfort me, I would still be drowned in tears. He lives, Emily. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of my bed with the same sweet, adorable smile he has always had. You cannot dream of the comfort this gives me.
Later, she sent for me to come and see some friend who wished especially to see me. It was General Sickles, and he said to the president in a loud, dictatorial voice, slapping the table with his hand, "You should not have that rebel in your house."
Excuse me, General Sickles. My wife and I are in the habit of choosing our own guests. We do not need from our friends either advice or assistance in the matter.
Although Brother Lincoln and Sister Mary have urged me to stay longer, I feel that my being here is more or less an embarrassment to all of us. And I'm longing for Kentucky and Mother.
Over the course of the war, Lincoln exercised his privilege to pardon deserters and war offenders more and more frequently. With Washington prisons filled to capacity with military prisoners, Lincoln matched his toughness as commander-in-chief with an almost legendary leniency. In a single stroke of the pen, Lincoln once commuted 62 death sentences. Lincoln's friend Leonard Swett was once bluntly brushed aside as Friday approached. Black Friday, Lincoln called it.
Get out of the way, Swett. Tomorrow is Butcher Day, and I must go through these papers and see if I cannot find some excuse to let these poor men off. I don't think shooting will do this one any good. I say let him go.
When it came to deserters, Lincoln said he was especially pigeon-hearted, particularly when it came to what he called his leg cases. How, he said, if the Almighty has given a fellow a pair of legs that wants to run away, can he do anything else but follow? Lincoln necessarily had the last word on all questions of military justice, and all questions of executions of soldiers had to come to his personal attention. He pardoned as many as he could, but we have to remember that of all the military executions in American history, more than half occurred during Lincoln's administration.
What a man he is. Occupied all day with matters of vast moment, deeply anxious about the fate of the greatest army of the world. He yet has such a wealth of simple good fellowship. At Gardner's gallery, we had a great many pictures taken. Some of the president, the best I have seen. Nico and I immortalized ourselves by having ourselves done in group with the press.
Cameras are painfully truthful. That cameraman seemed anxious about the picture. But boys, I didn't know what might happen to the camera.
On February 9th, Lincoln visited Brady's Washington Gallery for pictures. It was an historic day. The images that would later be used on the Lincoln penny and the $5 bill, both were taken this day. And so was the picture of the president with Tad that made the front pages.
Mr. Lincoln kept Tad with him almost constantly. I'm sure the times when he was really resting were when he was galloping around with Tad on his great shoulders.
General Grant was now a 3-time victor. The president wanted to meet him in person, to honor him with a promotion, that would put him in charge of all Union armies.
Washington was breezy with gossip about this strange man. The Grant legend was in the making. Upon his arrival at Willard's Hotel, he asked for a room and was told that there was only a small one on the top floor. "That will do," said Grant. And then he signed his name, Ulysses S. Grant. The clerk glanced idly at the signature and then, startled into life, urged on the general the bridal suite. People in the hotel lobby began whispering, "That's Grant."
I never met Mr. Lincoln until called to the Capitol to receive my commission as a lieutenant general. It was to be delivered to me at the Executive Mansion by President Lincoln in the presence of his cabinet.
The president knew from the buzz and the movement in the crowd that it must be him. And when a man of modest mien and unimposing exterior presented himself, the president said, "This is General Grant, is it?" The general replied, "Yes," and the two greeted each other cordially. After paying his respect, the general was greeted with cheer after cheer by the assembled crowd.
If you see the president, tell him from me that whatever happens, there will be no turning back.
Back on the front, Grant marched his army into the impenetrable forests and swamplands of inland Virginia, where Lee was known to be waiting. It became known as the Wilderness Campaign.
Grant has gone into the wilderness, crawled in, drawn up the ladder, and pulled in the hole after him.
Over the next 7 days, Grant lost 26,000 men, killed or wounded. It was the worst week's toll of the war. Still, he pushed forward. Traveling with the Army of the Potomac led by George Meade, Lieutenant General Grant made the major tactical decisions for the struggle toward Richmond. Pausing for moments between frequent engagements, he studied maps, conferred with Meade, gave orders to his chief of staff, and sent messages through his cipher operator. At every stop, horses were kept at the ready.
How near we have been to this thing before and failed. It is the dogged pertinacity of Grant that wins. Grant, hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible.
General Sherman called the period the supreme moment of Grant's life. In one furious 8 minutes, 12,000 men were killed or wounded. Union losses during just 1 month at places like Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor totaled 55,000, nearly the size of Lee's entire army.
The world has never seen so bloody or so protracted a battle as the one being fought, and I hope never will again.
My God, my God. 20,000 poor souls sent to their final account in one day. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it. The immense slaughter of our brave men chills and sickens us all. The hospitals are crowded with the thousands of mutilated and dying heroes who have poured out their blood in the Union cause.
During the battles of the Wilderness, Lincoln scarcely slept at all. He paced back and forth, his hands behind, great black rings under his eyes, his head bent forward upon his breast.
Over the course of the war, captured Southern soldiers suffered in filthy, overcrowded prison camps. But nothing could equal the plight of Union soldiers in Confederate camps. They were kept in conditions of near starvation. To them, death came as a blessed relief. In 1864, Lincoln helped to create a prisoner exchange program and sent Lucius Chittenden of Vermont to inspect the first releasees.
I went to Annapolis and saw in the hospitals all that remained of a party of over 300 enlisted men. They were men no longer. They were skeletons. The rags in which they had arrived 3 days before had been taken from their bodies and burned. They had been robbed of their blankets, clothes, and money, and then left to starve and die.
For the first time, Americans were now being made aware of just how ghastly and inhuman the war was. In addition, following Grant's staggering casualties in the wilderness, Lincoln called for the draft of another 500,000 recruits. It was more than the country could take. Draftees, considering themselves Lincoln's victims, bitterly complained that they were bound to free niggers or die.
A third of each day's mail consisted of piteous pleas for peace, for a termination of the long murder of the Civil War. Had not enough been endured?
Voices from everywhere cried out against the president.
Illinois beast, wet rag, tyrant, timid,
imbecile,
pitiable,
weak,
foul-tongued, shallow, dazed, and utterly foolish.
Amidst this popular discontent and hostile passion, the nation was compelled to plunge into a political contest.
I confess, I desire to be reelected. God knows I do not want the labor and responsibility of the office for another 4 years. But I honestly believe that I can better serve the nation in its need and peril than any new man could possibly do. I want to finish this job.
With him now was a new running mate, chosen to strengthen the ticket, the popular military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. By summer's end, Lincoln faced a powerful Democratic opponent, none other than George B. McClellan, the outspoken military leader upon whom the North had once pinned its hopes. Now campaigning against the president, McClellan was telling the country he was willing to end the war through compromise.
August 23rd, 1864. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. I'm going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly beaten. Way back in my childhood, I got hold of a small book, Weems' Life of Washington. I remember all the accounts there of the battlefields and struggles for the liberties of the country. I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. It was the promise that in due time, all should have an equal chance.
From boyhood, Lincoln had idolized the nation's founders. Incredibly, in 1864, 4 men who had been part of the Revolutionary War still lived. Samuel Downing had once fought for George Washington. Now he would vote for Abraham Lincoln.
The day of the presidential election in November 1864 was dark and rainy. Lincoln took no pains to conceal his anxious interest in the result of the election then going on all over the country.
That night was rainy, steamy, and dark. We splashed through the grounds to the side door of the War Department As the president entered, they handed him a dispatch claiming 10,000 Union majority in Philadelphia. The president sent over the first fruits to Mrs. Lincoln. He said, "She is more anxious than I."
As the tension of the evening mounted and all eyes focused on the election returns, Lincoln, in need of distraction, pulled out a book of humor and began to read aloud. Enraged by Lincoln's lack of seriousness, Edwin Stanton stormed out of the room.
Damn it to hell. Was there ever such inability to appreciate what is going on? Here is the fate of this whole republic at stake, and here is the man on whom it all depends. Turning aside from this monumental issue to read damn silly trash.
The people in the know, meaning congressmen, governors, political pundits, high-powered editors, tended to take a dim view of Lincoln and his administration as being incompetent, inefficient, and slow. This was in marked contrast to what the people of the country thought. Repeatedly, they spoke of him as our president, and though he was only in his 50s, they called him Old Abe, the father of his people.
As the evening wore on, everything depended on how the people decided to vote. And vote they did, giving Lincoln a decisive victory.
The election is over, and Abraham Lincoln is re-elected President of the United States. Thank God it is thus, for it's the salvation of the country.
From the hour of Mr. Lincoln's re-election, the Confederate cause was doomed.
But mixed with the night's elation was fear. Would-be assassins had openly vowed they would not let Lincoln live into a second term.
After midnight, we came home. Lamon came to my room, took a glass of whiskey, and then lay down at the president's door with a small arsenal of pistols and bowie knives around him.
For years, Lincoln had had premonitions of his own assassination. They began when he was first elected 4 years earlier, back in Springfield.
After my election in 1860, I was tired out and went home to rest. Opposite where I lay was a bureau with a swinging glass upon it. I saw myself reflected. My face, I noticed, had two separate and distinct images. One of the faces a little paler, say 5 shades than the other. I got up, and the thing melted away. My wife thought it was a sign that I was to be elected to a second term of office, and that the paleness of one of the faces was an omen that I should not see life through the last term.
Frequent letters were received warning Mr. Lincoln of assassination, but he never gave a second thought to them. The letters, however, sorely troubled his wife. She seemed to read impending danger in every rustling leaf, in every whisper of the wind.
Father, you should not go out alone. You know you are surrounded with danger.
All imagination. What does anyone want to harm me for? Don't worry about me, Mother, as if I were a little child, for no one is going to molest me.
Honorable A. Lincoln, I regret that you do not appreciate what I have repeatedly said to you in regard to the proper police arrangements connected with your household. You are in danger. Tonight, you went unattended to the theater. You ought to know that your life is sought after and will be taken unless you and your friends are cautious. You have many enemies within our lines.
Ever since summer, the actor John Wilkes Booth and his 2 brothers had planned a special New York benefit performance of the play Julius Caesar. On Friday, November 25th, the play was performed at New York's Winter Garden Theater to a packed house. It was proclaimed the greatest theatrical event in New York history. It was John Wilkes Booth's last serious performance. For several months, Booth had been increasingly restless, finding it difficult to pay attention to his acting career. He had never been as accomplished on stage as his famous eccentric father, Junius, or his older brother, Edwin, who early on knew not all was well with John.
Dear mother is happy with her children about her, thank God. But she still has an absent one, the youngest boy, strange, wild, and ever moving. He causes us all some degree of anxiety.
Much of my life's struggle has been with myself and in overcoming the evils of my untrained disposition.
As a boy, he once systematically exterminated every cat on his family's farm. As an actor, he could be outright violent.
He generally slept smothered in steak or oysters to cure his own bruises. Though an excellent swordsman, in his blind passion, he constantly cut himself. How he threw me about, once even knocked me down.
On several occasions, Booth had already touched the lives of the Lincolns. Tad had seen him act and said, "He makes me thrill." And Booth had presented the president's son with a rose. Another time, Lincoln was at the theater with some of Mary's relatives when the actor stopped near the president's box and shook his finger. Mary's guest turned to the president and said, "Mr. Lincoln, he looks as if he meant that for you."
Well, he does look pretty sharp at me, doesn't he?
Knowing his sympathy for the South, I was very much afraid he might go over the lines, and I begged him not to be so foolish. We have always been fearful of J. Wilkes.
Booth was living at the National Hotel, keeping horses in a stable off F Street behind Ford's Theater. Through his friendship with Edmund Spangler, a theater scene shifter, he had gained access to Ford's Theater night and day by all of its many entrances.
I had begun to think of myself as a coward and to despise myself.
December 1864. The war was now solidly in Northern hands. In Nashville, Tennessee, the Union was now in possession of the great southern fortress, the Capitol building. Off North Carolina, the largest American fleet ever assembled, over 70 vessels strong, positioned itself for a devastating bombardment of the Confederates' last coastal stronghold, Fort Fisher. The noose was tightening.
The war continues. All important lines and positions have been maintained. The most remarkable feature of the year is General Sherman's march of 300 miles directly through the insurgent region. Sherman's campaign will become famous in the annals of war.
I estimate the damage done at $100 million. We have devoured the land. Realize what war is, one should follow our tracks.
No one helped Lincoln escape from the horrors of the war more than Tad. But every time the president looked at his youngest son, he felt anxious. Unlike other children, Tad did not attend school, and with his education sorely neglected, he remained almost completely illiterate. With a special nurse to attend for his basic needs, he could not dress himself until the age of 8. Missing Willie, Tad began to creep into his father's bed more and more often. The child was so vulnerable, so open, so infirm emotionally, so loving, he tore at Lincoln's heart.
When this is over, I tell my boy Tad that we will go back to the farm. When I was happier as a boy when I dug potatoes at 25 cents a day than I am now. I tell him I will buy him a mule and a pony, and he shall have a little garden in a field all his own.
Lincoln's tenderness as a father was very different from the way he had been raised by his own father. Old-fashioned, stubborn, sometimes severe, Thomas Lincoln never received an invitation to Lincoln's wedding, was not ever invited to Springfield, and never once laid eyes on his daughter-in-law Mary or any of his grandchildren.
Lincoln's coldness was indeed remarkable. He did not go to his father's funeral. He never erected a stone over his father's grave. This didn't mean, I think, that the two hated each other. Thomas Lincoln was not an abusive parent, though he occasionally disciplined his son. Abraham Lincoln, after all, lived in his father's household willingly until he was 22 years old. After Lincoln became a Springfield attorney, he often gave his father money and supervised his financial matters. What was at stake here was that Thomas Lincoln and the whole Hanks connection represented a kind of life that Lincoln was trying to distance himself from. They represented a world he was leaving. An agricultural world, an unsuccessful, depressed, not very efficient world that he wanted to leave for a new, modern, industrializing society to which he now belonged.
Some of the chill between Lincoln and his father now seemed to repeat itself between the president and his own son, Robert. Away at Harvard during the presidential years, Robert almost never saw the man who sent him money and salutations. Lincoln was embarrassed that Robert was not in uniform, but until now, for Mary's sake, the president himself had blocked Robert's enlistment.
We have lost one son, and his loss is as much as I can bear, without being called upon to make another sacrifice. His services are not required in the field, and the sacrifice would be a needless one. He should stay in college a little longer. An educated man can serve his country with more intelligent purpose than an ignoramus.
But many a poor mother has given up all her sons, and our son is not more dear to us than the sons of other people are to their mothers. The services of every man who loves his country are required in this war. You should take a liberal instead of a selfish view of this question, Mother. Lieutenant General Grant, my son, now in his 22nd year, having graduated at Harvard, wishes to see something of the war before it ends. Could he, without embarrassment to you or detriment to the service, go into your military family with some nominal rank?
I will be most happy to have him in my military family in the manner you proposed.
I cannot bear to have Robert exposed to danger. Grant is a butcher and is not fit to be at the head of an army. He loses 2 men to the enemy's 1. If the war should continue 4 years longer and he should remain in power, he would depopulate the North.
In late January, Lincoln received the latest in a series of troubling letters from his relatives back home.
I write to inform you that your mother has not and does not receive 1 cent of the money you send her, and she now needs clothing and shoes. Uncle Dennis has the money in his pockets and is cussing you all the time. He's threatened to put your mother on the country.
Lincoln had tried to look after his stepmother's interests, but such words from a bickering clan painfully served to remind him just how far he had traveled from his own roots. Under a majestic, newly completed £9 million Capitol dome, the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett became the first of his race ever to speak in the halls of Congress.
Let slavery die. Its death warrant is signed by God and man. Do not commute its sentence. Give it no respite. Let it be ignominiously executed.
The President's Emancipation Proclamation had one fatal flaw. As a War Powers Act, it could not be counted on to survive into peacetime. For that, a constitutional amendment was needed, what Lincoln had come to call a king's cure for all the evils. On January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives cast its long-awaited vote on the most important legislation in the entire century, the 13th Amendment, outlawing slavery forever.
I congratulate myself, the country, and the whole world upon this great moral victory.
With slavery abolished and the war almost over, Lincoln's second term approached. For many, the American spirit itself seemed to be summed up in him. Committed to innovation and progress, Lincoln's presidency was filled with firsts. He signed a bill creating the first Congressional Medal of Honor. He was the first president to authorize the Treasury Department to levy an income tax. He was the first president to issue paper money and the first to inscribe U.S. coins with "In God We Trust." He established free mail delivery in 49 cities, made it possible to send money orders through the mails, and he was the first to receive a transcontinental message when the telegraph lines between the Atlantic and the Pacific were finally completed. Lincoln's daily habits were simple, his White House routine peculiarly his own.
The president rose early, as his sleep was light and capricious. His breakfast was an egg and a cup of coffee.
He ate mechanically. I have seen him sit down at the table, and never, unless recalled to his senses, would he think of food. He was a peculiar man.
His size 14 feet gave him trouble.
I shall never get these boots on till I wear them a day or two and stretch them a little.
Sometimes Lincoln decided against wearing boots and throughout the morning kept his slippers on. They made flip-flop sounds on the White House floors.
I like to give my feet a chance to breathe.
A servant tended his hair and beard, tying a napkin around the president's neck and shaking the clippings out of the White House window. He called his hair his bristles, and once, having been handed a delicate comb, asked, "Haven't you anything you comb your horse's mane with?"
I remember very well one incident. I was sent for by the president, who was in his own room. To my great surprise, I saw that he was struggling with a needle and thread. He was sewing a button on his trousers. "All right," he said, looking at me with a twinkle in his eye. "Just wait until I repair damages."
Lincoln had a wonderful sense of humor. He loved puns, for example. The more outrageous, the better. Once he and Seward were walking down Pennsylvania Avenue and they spied a sign on a store saying T.R. Strong. Pointing to it, Lincoln said, "Tea are strong, but coffee are stronger," which was outrageous. He loved anecdotes. He loved to tell stories at great length. Often he did so with some purpose. Namely, a tedious visitor came in, he did not want to give a negative reply. He would be reminded of a little story and proceed to tell it with great gusto, slapping his thighs and chuckling and rising and escorting his visitor to the door, and the man would leave puzzled as to what the president had actually said.
As time wore on, and the war held its terrible course. Lincoln's demeanor and disposition changed, so gradually that it would be impossible to say when the change began. The boisterous laughter became less frequent year by year. He aged with great rapidity.
I'm very unwell. My feet and hands always cold. I suppose I ought to be in bed. Sometimes I think I am the tiredest man on earth.
Lincoln had lost over 20 pounds during his presidency. 4 years earlier, his face was that of a dynamic, eager leader with unbounded energies. Now it had become the face of a tired and tortured, yet kindly and spiritual old man. He had just passed his 56th birthday. By early 1865, John Wilkes Booth had decided to kidnap Lincoln and smuggle him across the Potomac into the hands of waiting Confederates. Booth formed his plot inside a newly opened boarding house. It belonged to Mary Surratt, and here was the nest in which the conspiracy was hatched.
It is to this man the South owes so much misery. For 4 years I have waited, hoped, and prayed for the dark clouds to break. To wait longer would be a crime.
The day of Lincoln's second inauguration was somber and drizzly. Great crowds of men and women streamed around the Capitol building. Precisely on the stroke of 12 appeared Hannibal Hamlin, whose term of office was now expiring. He was arm in arm with Vice President-elect Andrew Johnson, whose face was extraordinarily red. He was evidently intoxicated.
The vice president has humiliated his friends. I said to Stanton, who was on my right, Johnson is either drunk or crazy. Stanton replied, there is evidently something wrong.
With a fresh haircut, the president waited to speak. Hannibal Hamlin was grim-faced, humiliated by Andrew Johnson's lack of dignity. Johnson held his hat in front of his face, while his friend, Senator Doolittle of Wisconsin, waited to take him out and walk him around until sober. On the balustrade above the president, wearing a top hat, loomed John Wilkes Booth. Just below the speaker's stand, 5 suspicious faces later seemed to match those who would be accused of being part of the conspiracy. Lewis Payne, Confederate deserter. George Atzerodt, ferryman for Confederate spies. David Harold, dim-witted drugstore clerk. John Surratt, rebel spy. Edward Spangler, scene shifter at Ford's Theater.
The country was formed for the white, not for the black man. And I, for one, have ever considered slavery one of the greatest blessings that God ever bestowed upon a favored nation. What an excellent chance I had to kill the president if I had wished.
Abraham Lincoln, rising tall and gaunt among the groups about him, stepped forward and read his inaugural address. As he advanced from his seat, a roar of applause shook the air. Just at that moment, the sun, which had been obscured all day, burst forth and flooded the spectacle with light.
4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Both parties deprecated war. But one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
For the first time in my life, and I suppose the first time in any colored man's life, I attended the reception of President Lincoln on the evening of the inauguration. As I approached the door, I was seized by two policemen and forbidden to enter. I said to them that they were mistaken entirely in what they were doing, that if Mr. Lincoln knew that I was at the door, he would order my admission, and I bolted in by them. In less than half a minute, I was invited into the East Room of the White House, a perfect sea of beauty and elegance. I could not have been more than 10 feet from him when Mr. Lincoln saw me. His countenance lighted up, and he said in a voice which was heard all around, "Here comes my friend Douglas." As I approached him, he reached out his hand and gave me a cordial shake.
Douglas, I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address. There's no man's opinion that I value more than yours. What do you think of it?
Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort.